as pedagogy and undertake research in this upcoming multidisciplinary area of interest. I, Dr. Aditi Ved, on behalf of SVV fraternity, would heartily like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Tuomas, Professor of Information Studies and Interactive Media, Tampere University, Finland, Dr. Upinder Dhar, SVV Vice Chancellor, Dr. Jigyasu Dubey, Coordinator, Center of Excellence in Simulation and Gaming, our invited guests, eminent panel members, participants, and dear students. Today's webinar under the Pratiti is on the topic Ambient, Playfulness, and Ubiquitous Play, and the resource person is Dr. Tuomas. So before starting, let me give the audience a brief introduction about him. He's a professor of information studies and interactive media at Tampere University, Finland. He is a regional editor for Journal Information Research and one of the former executive editors of both International Journal of Role Playing and Simulation and Gaming. He is a firm believer in that communities of games research should more actively learn about each other. So we welcome you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can see my slides, which is,
yes,
of course, one of the questions everyone asks during any Zoom or Teams presentation. So following the proud tradition. Okay, I will now be closing my, actually not closing my camera. We continue with this. So my topic for today is Ambient, Playfulness, and Ubiquitous Play, which is sort of the title of a forthcoming book chapter by myself, Dr. Jaakko Stenroos, and our local playfulness researcher, Mr. Leland Masek. I've been very long debating sort of which concepts to use here, but the core idea is that we are currently seeing the expansion of playful thinking and playful behavior, and especially playful mindsets in all sorts of areas of our everyday lives, from work to free time and domestic environments and so forth. So playfulness in some sense is becoming an ambient phenomenon that is present overall, and we mostly now mark the moments when we are not being playful. So it has experienced this kind of everyday transformation. I will be talking a bit more about this as we go further in this talk. And then ubiquitous play, the idea that the action of play, and especially gameplay, is now present in all sorts of circumstances and environments. So we have come a very long way from the situations where mostly games and gameplay were something that was set aside very clearly from the everyday life. And of course, we have concepts like Heisinghas' magic circle that say that play and games are separated by a barrier from the everyday life. But I am slightly now contesting that idea over the next 40-45 minutes about whether we are actually seeing these still as separate, or if there is more of a porous boundary between things nowadays, and whether something has changed or not. And I hope you will have plenty of questions after this, either through email or during this session that is being recorded. So very quickly, my background was already mentioned. I've been editing the International Journal of Role Playing and Simulation and Gaming, and one of my practices, as mentioned in the introduction, has been the idea to look into different traditions and different communities that study games. I personally stand a bit outside of both game studies and the iSaga tradition of instrumental gaming and its study, because I am at the core an information scholar, so I look at these phenomena from different directions. But I've grown up with many of these traditions, like Isaga and Tigra and others, and I've been hoping that they would be more interested in citing each other and learning from the paradigms and traditions of each other. So the concept for today's talk comes from especially Duke's book, Gaming the Future's Language from 1974, and then the works by Kathy Greenblatt and Duke in 75, and the updated edition of 81, which I very briefly already showed to some before we started the recording. So the idea here is that games, according to Duke, would allow us to discuss very complex phenomena through providing a Gestalt communication. So games would be eventually able to show us complete systems and allow us to discuss the properties and behavior of those systems. This is very much oversimplified from the book, but still understanding these larger phenomena using games as a kind of future's language through which we can understand these things and we can share concepts, we can share an understanding. And according to this line of thought, the complexity of our world increases in many contexts, and it very clearly has done so over these last decades or the last few hundred years, and it does so at an increasing pace. And the idea here is that the games may be able to show us these phenomena so that we can debate and also learn about them and use the games to increase our understanding and maybe even enact change. But what we argue here, me and my colleagues, or me today, is that this is something that is happening in certain kinds of games, but most of the gaming we see and gameplay that we see does not yet, at least, provide us with this kind of communication where we could talk about wholes and complete phenomena, and instead we are playing side by side like small children before they learn to play together. So I am kind of saying that this is a nice ideal. It's not yet available to us, but maybe we will be learning how to use it eventually. Some games, we can argue, do provide this kind of complex understanding of things, and this is mostly connected to games where we have massive numbers of players who are able to form smaller communities and then talk about the phenomena that are being experienced. They can plan together and so forth. Common examples include massively multiplayer online role-playing games, such as researchers' favorite World of Warcraft, which for a time was the most popular such game. Another example in some ways is Pokemon Go and the ways in which it calls people from different backgrounds to play together, plan together, attend events together, and so forth. But still, I would argue that people are more and more playing these still side by side instead of using them for the instrumental purpose of understanding something larger. Now, I am not saying at all that there is something wrong about recreational gaming. I am simply here examining the proposition that we could also understand other things through the play. Researchers bring forth these kinds of environments that have almost completely player-generated content as a kind of approach that might be valuable here. So for instance, EVE Online is a game that gets often mentioned because it's completely libertarian, almost anything goes interaction between players in the contested space environments is something that is able to show some of this complex understanding, and the game lures people to use Excel sheet like things and call it fun. So obviously there is some kind of an attraction here. Another one would be DayZ, the zombie survival game, which is also mentioned by a lot of researchers and players as a kind of environment where people are really learning together, creating content together, and they are interacting strongly with each other. I will return to some examples of these if I have possibly more time later on. But for now, let's think about the proposition that games supposedly tell us something about the complexity of the world, but in general, we are playing those alone or in small groups of like-minded people, and therefore we are not necessarily reaching the full learning potential of these games. And here also learning as opposed to, for instance, a more formal educational potential that we do see in some games. And to understand the complexity of the argument, we sort of need to think about what we talk about when we say play, because as I mentioned, there's this ambient playfulness available for us in many kinds of contexts. And playfulness is not the same as being engaged in play, nor is play always completely related to games, and playfulness and games is yet another conceptual semi-match, we could say. So when I hear today talk about playing, I mean especially game playing instead of playgrounds and so forth. But play is a very large phenomenon, as we've known for a very long time, citing Heisinghar and Kalua and others from the classic side. Jaakko Stenroos's doctoral dissertation is the place where I still recommend people look into when examining these concepts. But centrally, sort of, we can be playful while not engaged in play. We can have the playful attitude towards things. We can enjoy small moments of play even during other activities. We can treat other activities as kinds of play. So this is where Duke's ideal, to some extent, does happen for people, just not systematically. But we can play games while not being at all playful. Stenroos's example is an adult playing a rather boring game with a child. So the child is probably being very playful. The adult is enduring the activity. And so the framing is one thing, the mindset is another thing, and understanding how these function is something that allows us to understand games and play related phenomena better, also in contexts that are not framed as games. This is combined then with the fact that information and communication technologies have become really ambient. They are all around us unless we are in very specific environments. So in general, regardless of where we are in the world, distinguishing between online and offline has become more and more difficult. If one only has a smartphone with Facebook attached to it, then possibly the lines are clearer. But if we think about smart homes, or the fact that we are all carrying very efficient computing devices with ourselves that provide us access to games, it's like it's completely interlaced with everyday life. Our uses of these things is often brief. It is asynchronous with other people, and it is something that usually follows certain patterns. So one action to the next, which is why it's called sequential. And this would take us far away from understanding games if we explore these concepts and what they in totality mean. But here, sort of the idea that we quickly access stuff very easily, we check something, or we check a game for a very short period, it drives us towards certain kinds of uses of information technology, and this very much includes most of the games that people nowadays seem to play. And the logics of platforms drive us to use these in ways that are not exactly optimal for us. And I do not just mean business here, but also towards individualized uses where we do not get the Gestalt communication effects so well to our hands. So my point or central argument is that a lot of the time that we spend as being actively playful in our everyday environments are closed games. So games we play alone or separated from others. And in essence, it's a kind of situation where in a streetcar you can see other people play, but they're all separate. We are not joining in games that we would be playing together. If we want to be playful, we pick up something like Candy Crush and play it individually, or we make separate time at home to play the massively multiplayer online role-playing game or something like this. So it is still something that is essentially set aside from other activities, even though it is done in the midst of or on top of these other activities. And this means that most of the time that we are engaged in playing games, we are interacting with very dedicated, limited, closed environments where we see the supposed magic circle very clearly if we take a step back, and we increasingly learn to use these as something that has its own systems and own logics and is simplified in many ways. Ian Bogost, in his excellent book from 2007, talks about procedural literacies. So the idea that in most cases of gameplay, we learn to address the specific phenomena, the specific logics of individual game systems. And we become good with those, but it is not at all as common that we can take away something from that particular system. If we are really spending mental energy, learning, and time to understand how that system then compares to others, including the real world, then we have some things we pick up from those, and then we can talk about this game as a kind of tool for understanding. But in general, we become good with just that particular game, maybe pick up some skills from it that we can apply to another game that has very similar mechanics, but that's about it. And then we celebrate the instances when someone has learned to do something based on that particular game, but that is still somewhat considered the exception or a learning deployment specifically designed to facilitate the goal of picking up something from there. It is not us understanding games as a kind of communication tool with others. So we see glimpses of Duke's goals when we use games for learning purposes, but not still, I would argue, the whole approach. So in general, we have these limited systems. We become really good at playing with them, but just with them. At the same time, this is expanding more and more. I like to use cats as an example here, but in general, Hanna Virman, for instance, has written about zoo animals being also able to play. So play is expanding. We're taking it everywhere and showing these signs that we might be able to use the Gestalt communication approaches of this with everything, including our non-human partners and associates. Then again, does this mean that we would be sharing an understanding with the cats? I probably do not think so. So the play is expanding. It's becoming more and more ambient, but it's seeing these individualized permutations, not becoming the communication tool that we envision it to be. And this is especially emphasized by what I mentioned already earlier, and we'll talk a bit more about soon also. So we have become isolated from each other in the sense of digital wayfaring. This is a concept I've picked up from Larissa Jurtz and Ingrid Richardson's book. I will be showing its cover again at the end of this short webinar lecture. So we experience a kind of digital wayfaring. So when we have empty time, we play, we dive into these ubiquitous small worlds of play in order to fight off boredom, because it's our routines, because the games are really attractive in a way that might lead to even discussions on addiction. So those silos I mentioned, it's very easy to slip into them. I do this every morning. My wife does it every evening. We play games that take us away from communication for a short while. So there's this idea that we are more and more seeing gameplay, especially as part of something that is a way of digitally isolating ourselves from others. When a person comes to a bus and puts on the big earphones, listening to music, it's creating a kind of mental being elsewhere, focus away from the activity that is actually taking place kind of situation. There is this sense of mobile privacy, as mentioned by Jurt and Richardson. So we are building areas where we are, through the gameplay, through the listening of music or watching of quick videos, signaling to others around us something that is completely the opposite of the dreams of Duke and Greenblatt. So saying, do not communicate with me. It creates, for some, of course, this kind of sense of a safety in the place. You do not become disturbed by others more likely because you are engaged in gameplay, you are engaged in listening to music. So we have this auditory and mental privatization of the space. And this is, I would argue, a normal default mode for a lot of this. So we are not using games to communicate. We are using them for standing apart. Exceptions, again, exist. So we have the guilds of an MMORPG, or we have the random talks with strangers of Pokemon Go encounters. But in general, if we look at statistics, what are people playing? They are playing stuff that keeps them apart from other humans, and even also from the animals that are supposedly playing with us. At the same time, nevertheless, I see a glimmer of hope here, in the sense that this is still environmentally aware play. So the people playing these idle games or separating themselves from others through gameplay, they are not oblivious usually to their environments. They are still perceiving what is happening. They know when to step off the bus in most cases, even though they are playing the game. Of course, the games are facilitating this with possibility of being paused, if they are. Many are not. But still, we have the people able to perceive when something is happening outside of play, and they are able to either stop playing or pause the game. But this too is a kind of problematic concept, in the sense, for instance, that when my colleagues looked into people's reports of playing Pokemon Go and ending up in what they considered to be dangerous environments, so a bad part of town, for instance, those were very gendered responses. So men who would not have as much to fear in urban spaces would be the ones, almost solely the ones, who would say that they would end up in places they did not anticipate. So environmental non-awareness is in many ways a privileged position. So you can't really immerse fully into the game safely, because you might end up somewhere if you have not learned outside of play to be careful enough of what you do. So the aforementioned awareness is kind of important skill. Same with the idea that playing alone somewhere is completely safe, is connected to other privileges, such as in the US, for instance, how you look to observing eyes. So it is dangerous to play in places one is not considered belonging in, and all of this creates still one more round of not really being able to share experiences through play, because the combination of who you are and your play environment can be so very different from others. So we are not learning from one another either through the play, even though we would be playing very similarly and we would be playing the very same games. And finally, we come to where these phenomena might intersect. So the concepts of gamification, which of course have been partially at least overtaken through marketing hype and talk that oversimplifies the phenomenon. So gamification in its most in its widest sense and its widest deployments is something where we no longer see the barriers of individual games, but it does have the problem of oversimplifying something, of rewarding certain activities through the most simplified versions of gamifications of the points, badges, leaderboards kind. So if done not completely right and not while thinking of this idea of understanding a shared gestalt, then it leads us to look at particulars. It makes us observe the same kinds of procedural literacies that individual games do. So making activities just into something we complete in order to get the rewards, and that's it, as opposed to understanding something together. But if we take gamification in the perspective of understanding the best parts of games and using the parts of games in other environments so that we can have a kind of shared grammar or even vocabulary of those wider environments, of those systems, then we might be seeing here something where we are able to discover a new kind of procedural literacy. So by introducing game elements into wider shared activities, where we already share some of those activities and the outlooks from a common point, then the added game parts might be able to create a situation where we have procedural literacies about the actual reality or the shared activity together. And in this sense, we might be able to develop something actually close to the ideals from our predecessors in understanding games such as Duke and Greenblatt. So we might see here a way of really achieving Gestalt communication about phenomena we consider valuable. And there are, of course, challenges to this, because this can become a very controlled sense of what we are learning. I'm not very fond, for instance, of the Chinese social credit approach to gamification, where everyday life is controlled by these game-like qualities and social control and so forth. I am suspicious, at the very least, of deploying these kinds of procedural skills in the workification of play or introduction of very controlled points, badges, leaderboards elements to everyday work, because that too is a kind of deviation from the happy, playful spirit of these activities envisioned by the people who have been suggesting this approach as good. So it's easy to get sidetracked from this, and therefore we also need the games themselves, both in learning contexts and in free-form recreational play, so that we remember what the important part of gameplay is for many of us. So they provide a kind of context which would allow us better to understand the contexts where the game elements are deployed, so that they can be a communication tool instead of just something that is played for the fun of it. So by having the games, by having a gameful attitude to the world, and by having positive instances of gameful environments, storyfied schools and other things, this combination will keep us flexible enough and entertained and interested enough to be able to then also pick up the communication skills we need. Because as already was pointed out by authors such as Razor or Clubbers, that since we can't completely model the activities we want to discuss, so we can't make games that would directly connect strongly enough with all aspects of reality, those becomes too complex. We should combine the play with our environmental understanding, bridge the gaps that currently exist with the ubiquitous gameplay we are seeing and our playful relationship to the world. If we can combine these, then we will be possibly able to learn more about what is happening. And one other aspect where we see important things about this is organizational games. I know many of you in the audience are people involved with these. So a type of game already exists where we can facilitate discussion about what is happening in our organizations or in our contexts in a wider sense. It gives us a playful alibi to critique what is maybe problematic in the organizational context we are working with, and through that provides possibilities for a more positive engagement. We see how these games allow us to be playful about serious things and then provide elements for improving those elements or insight for improving what is happening. So we have already some traditions of games where playification of things inspires and liberates if done right, and is a risk if we do not deploy it correctly enough. But my idea here is that if we take concepts from the way in which we have been teaching and learning from playing in organizations, this is something that would probably also enlighten us on how to do this positively in a wider sense. So to summarize what I've been talking about, we have had, as Eric Zimmerman calls it, a ludic turn in culture over the last century. We're playing more and more. We are playing more freely. We are playing all over the place in many cases. We definitely consider games now more valuable than we did some time ago. We're seeing them both as more interesting and as more useful. And what I'm advocating here is making them still more useful by embracing what our founding theorists have been saying, because we've experienced a ludic turn in culture. We have not yet experienced the ways in which games can be a communication tool. We are seeing glimpses in shared online play, in the ways in which people are aware of their surroundings while playing, and in the ways in which organizational play is providing results for others, not just the players involved. So our goal here is that we still need to move towards even more ambient playfulness, so that we would be embracing playful activities together and discussing those activities. Right now we are discussing separate games. We need to do much more. We need to have that playfulness interact with references to the real world or to phenomena we want to model or so forth in the right way. So not go in towards the darker paths of deploying these techniques just as methods of control. We need to use them in ways that inspire us to communicate, to share information, to share the best practices and the best technologies involved. And I believe that if we approach this the right way, we will start enjoying the benefits that Duke, for instance, states. So this is where we can go. And the tools we have for this change is that we have learned how to read games and play. We developed the procedural literacies quite quickly. We just need to develop them in a wider sense than we have before, from individual games to something broader. We already share enough about these individual silos with each other that we're able to use concepts from games and play to discuss these phenomena with others. So we can say something like, okay, this is like a thing in Candy Crush, and most people will understand what we're talking about. So we have reached this kind of game literacy level where we can borrow concepts from one to the other one. We are just not fully using it yet in the wider sense that would be possible for it. We are already playing the wider systems, but we are perceiving only parts of that play. So we need to expand our perceptions to understanding how the games happen in the contexts in which they happen, and how much we could take into a wider positive, maybe gamified or playified system that exists all around us and that we can interact with. So let's take the lessons from these and expand those further and think about how well we could deploy them to support the entirety of the human experience, instead of just providing the quick fix or the quick tool or the slight perception change of now. We are already playing almost everywhere, something I've borrowed from Youth and Richardson for this, and that is a good start. Reading about it, for instance, from this book or from the original classics would be a good guide for how to start reaching the goals that we mentioned. We play, let's just use that play for a bit more communication. And with this, I end my presentation and ask whether you have questions. Thank you.
So participants, if you have any question, please post it in the chat box.
Panelists may ask the questions directly. Yes, Vinod sir, please.
No, first, Elizabeth.
Well, there's two things. First, Tuomas, thank you for an, as usual, challenging presentation. There's so much in what you've said in the last period to think about. I guess my question is the practice. How do we, I agree with what you're advocating, but how do we do it? How do we, what are the, the minute by minute or the small steps that we can take?
Between us researchers, for instance, I think we should be engaging with this phenomenon a lot more, talking about the commonalities between the games or the commonalities of the play practices with the realities existing outside of us. So from where I'm sitting, it seems so much more common and probably easier to, for instance, analyzing just a single game or deploying it for a client very quickly. We're not talking about the full potential of these tools as tools. We're currently just teaching them and treating them as kind of shorter examples.
I feel like you've opened a door into a vast library. And it's a bit scary to step through, but I agree very much with what you're saying. Vinod, you had a question.
Yes. This has been confusing me for several years. When people speak about a game, they say a game is full of play. And when we speak about playing, we play a game. So how do we distinguish these two expressions, play and game, in such a way that the two are very clearly, distinctively apart?
Yes, my friend Jaakko wrote a 300 and something page book about this very distinction and got a doctorate with that. I highly recommend Dr. Stenroos's book, but still, sort of from my perspective, there is this mindset of being playful, which is something. Then we have the activity of play, which can take place either free form or it can be formalized through sets of both written and tacit rules into an instance of formalized play we would call a game. And the game usually being a self-contained system, especially so in the case of digital games or formalized board games, where you really have an artifact of some kind, whether digital or not, that is crystallizing what can and cannot be done. And usually our playful minds, from the perspective I embrace, the playful minds are present when we then play these or we interact with similar systems in our everyday lives, including in gamification, if it's done in a positive sense. So there we see the playfulness of the activity, but in many cases also it's possible that these do not exist together. And the more we delve into the darker sides of play related phenomena, the more separate these are. So for instance, in a common example used by scholars, in a bullying situation, it can be very much play and playful for the person abusing the situation, but for the victim it's definitely not play, it's dead serious. So we cannot clearly distinguish with any of these, but we can point out to these clear lines where something is or is not happening. So from a very simplified perspective, this activity is usually confined through a set of rules or a set of shared practices with someone, and then we hopefully engage with it in a positive, playful spirit, which makes the activity way more enjoyable for all who are concerned with it.
See, to my mind, if we have to differentiate, when we are saying playing, we are referring to the activity. Whereas when we are talking about game, that is the design.
Yes.
So something may be a game by design, whereas something that we play is reference to the activity. So if there is a game, then we may be playing it. So there are certain rules, prescribed rules for playing that game. Therefore, I won't see them separately. They are related.
Oh, yes, I completely agree. They are strongly related.
Yeah.
And the rules are a clear element defining these limits. I very much look forward to an upcoming book from MIT Press, which is called The Rule Book, where a couple of really good scholars next month will present their ideas on how much games and also more free-form play are governed by rules. So hopefully we'll have the next steps for this discussion. And hopefully you will eventually have interesting new lecturers to also listen to in one of these.
Yes, sure. We would also like to procure that book.
Mm.
We would like to have that book for our library.
Mm.
So you have to let us know as and when it is released.
Yes, I am not connected to it in any way, but I'm super interested in the topic. I will. Yes, we
Sure.
have another question in line.
Sure.
Hi, Doctor. I'd just like to find out, you mentioned something about gamification. I just want to clarify what you meant by that on gamification. And you mentioned about it's limited to the points and badges and leaderboard. Are you saying that that is a very limited view of gamification, or is that?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. So there is, it is the sort of traditional idea of what gamification is, and it is only a shallow look at it. So gamification in the sense of introducing game-like qualities and elements to activities we do not normally consider to be games. It contains a lot more possibilities than the original old marketing hype of points, badges, leaderboards, and things like that contain. And for instance, the framing of an activity with a great story in it can be an act of gamification. The way in which we can use the communications aspects of games to make other activities more interesting, using the very ideals espoused by people like Duke, is something that is part still also of this gamification. So trying to find the positive and interesting in games beyond just the simplified challenges and introducing those to the activities we want to make not just more interesting but more meaningful. This is where I see the full potential of this, and where I also see the full potential of us understanding how games function. So in order to do good, positive gamification, in my opinion, you need to understand good, positive gaming as
I'm
well.
so
And
glad you say that. I'm so glad that
an example or something that you could share where they have looked at a realm that is wider than that traditional realm. Is there a working example of that?
I would have plenty. For instance, over the last few weeks, I've been looking into recent doctoral dissertations here at my own university. Isabella Aura defended excellently on the topic of storifying school education and learning. So using that side of gamification for positive experiences, more motivation, and so forth. And then we had Daniel Fernandez Galliote defending about climate change, gaming and gamification very recently. Very good book. Both of these are available online, open access, so you're able to check what they have been writing about. But those would be my most recent and up-to-date examples, and they have great lists of references where you can follow these lines of thought further very easily.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any more questions?
I have an irrelevant, frivolous comment to make. This is addressed to Tuomas. Thomas, you used a word that is very frequent in India, but I have not heard it used often outside. And I hear, of course, this is by way of rumor, that it is frowned upon to use the word prepone outside India. And I noticed that you used it at least once today, and I was pleasantly surprised. I was also happy that you used it. I believe the correct form of the word is advance, which is the opposite of postpone. I noticed you said prepone something, but when you used prepone, I was so happy I forgot what you mentioned, what you connected it with.
I usually use such concepts for promoting a positive kind of approach to certain topics. So yes, and I very much want to here emphasize again the fact that I'm a firm believer in us learning from other games using and game studies communities from one to the next. So maybe borrowing a few positive terms here and there is a good thing. Thank you for listening to me today. It's been interesting.
Thank you, that was fun.
Thank you. May I now invite Dr. Upinder Dhar, Vice Chancellor, SWV Indore, for the concluding remarks.
It was great to listen to Tuomas and some of the concepts which he has clarified in his deliberation. Well, as all of you know, or most of you know, that we had started this series called Pratiti for, say, more than 2 years, 3 years back. I think 3 years back, December 2021, we had started it. And now we are in the process of analyzing.
October 2020.
October 2020. Okay, so that means 3 years plus. And now we are in the process of analyzing what we have done so far. And we see that most of the panelists, particularly say speakers, have been from Netherlands, followed by India, Japan, and other countries. And the further analysis is going on to understand what kind of content has been presented during this Pratiti in these 3 years, and what is the way forward, what now, how we have been learning from these webinars, that content, the feedback, based on the feedback, we are having of thousands of participants. We are analyzing to understand the extent of learning that has happened, and also the extent of understanding that has happened. Interestingly, we have found that majority of participants are youngsters, particularly when we look at the Indian context. In India, simulation and gaming is emerging as an important pedagogy now. And more institutions, particularly leading institutions in higher education, are using simulation and gaming now. Therefore, the challenge is to develop the faculty. The faculty who are comfortable with using these simulation and gaming, and who know about simulation and gaming, who understand, who can design games for their students. And in that series that we have started recently, we had Elizabeth with us. She did a fantastic job by conducting a 1-week faculty development program in which we had faculty from our university and other universities also, other states also. And the feedback has been very encouraging and very good. Therefore, getting encouraged by this effort, we would be continuing with these faculty development programs in future as an extension of these webinars. So there is continuity. Webinars series has been going on for more than 3 years now, but as a continuity based on our learnings, we started the faculty development programs, which will go on parallelly. The webinars will not stop. that will also continue. Because if I understand correctly, in the history of Visaga, and credit goes to COVID-19, that for the first time, we started involving more and more people by starting this this webinar series called Pratiti. So I'm sure that all those who have been connected with us will continue to take interest and will continue to learn from each other. Today also we had an excellent session by Tuomas, and I hope that you will remain connected with us and keep on giving new ideas so that this goes on, and there are encouraging takeaways from what we have been learning. Jagdishwaran has also been associated with us right from almost from the beginning, and Elizabeth, of course, is active as a participant, as a resource person also. So I'm very much thankful to all of you for keeping it on, and we will continue to make our efforts to popularize this pedagogy, simulation in gaming, SNG, as a pedagogy. And in Indian context, one national education policy was released in 2020. And in this policy, gamification has been mentioned as one of the pedagogies which should be used, because now focus has to be on innovation. So we need to be innovative in our approach so far as teaching learning process is concerned. So this is gaining more importance from that point of view. So what we are doing through Pratiti. So I wish all the best to everybody, and I would request everyone to remain connected in future, and this Pratiti will continue in future as well. Thank you very much. I don't know how many of you are going to New Zealand for the next saga. Elizabeth will be there. I know about her.
Oh yes, I'll
Tuomas,
be
are you
there.
going to attend the next saga?
Unfortunately not.
Oh,
It is a long way from Finland.
yeah, that is in July.
Yes.
Jagdishwaran is going.
I have yet to check the calendar.
Oh,
Doctor.
yet to.
I will join New Zealand. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes,
All
that
right.
is in a neighborhood to Australia. All right, but in any way, that is in July, so we will be meeting again next month in Pratiti. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Da.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Good
Thank
night.
you, everyone. So I
Okay,
request
bye-bye.
all the participants to please fill the feedback mentioned in the box to get the
Yes,
e-certificate.
Yes. Carry
that's
on.
fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was saying I request all the participants to please fill the feedback form to get the e-certificates. We'll be meeting again with the next webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
So Vinod sir, we will meet today at 9:30. See you on mute.
जी कैसे जी नमस्ते।
नमस्कार शर्मा जी, क्या हाल चाल है?
मैं ठीक हूँ, आप कैसे हो?
हम भी ठीक हैं।
वेरी गुड।
नमस्ते, नमस्कार।
गुड
हो गया?
आफ्टरनून। हाउ आर यू?
All well, sir. Good to see you.
Actually, I had to go to office, but then something emergent came, and I thought that I will finish that work and then go. But it took a lot of time, and I'm still working on something. So
वो ये
it is
28th वाला,
indirectly work from home going on.
वो 28th का डेडलाइन वही है क्या?
No, it was some other document for the university.
अच्छा, ओके। बाकी सब ठीक है सर?
Yes. Why this my video looks funny?
Video is fine.
but I am finding my video very strange.
I can see quite okay. There is a light behind you. Maybe
It is the
Yes.
tube
perhaps
light.
that is why.
Tube
But
light
from
there.
us, from my side, it's clear.
Okay.
It's very clear.
Okay, then nice presentation of him today.
Right, so we'll connect in about 2-3 days time.
हाँ, sure, certainly.
वो 29th को अगर हो सके तो भेज दीजिए सर वो PPT.
हाँ, ठीक है, जरूर.
हाँ.
Sure.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Suji.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
दुबे जी,
जी सर.
ये जो स्केल बनाते थे ना, it should be
जी.
in positive numbers 1 2
Okay.
3 4 5.
हम्म.
एक मिनट मैं खोलूंगा.
जी.
जब आप कहते हैं कि स्ट्रांगली अग्री, उसको जो कुछ भी स्कोर देते हैं,
हम्म.
डिसएग्री और स्ट्रांगली डिसएग्री उसका ऑपोजिट होना चाहिए, माइनस होना चाहिए.
हाँ.
अगर स्ट्रांगली अग्री को 2 दे देंगे तो अग्री को 1, न्यूट्रल को 0 और डिसएग्री को -1, स्ट्रांगली को -2 करना पड़ेगा.
ओके.
उसको स्कोरिंग करने के लिए और प्रोसेसिंग करने के लिए दिक्कत है.
फिर इसको
और उस टाइम पे हम ये नहीं कर सकते हैं कि स्ट्रांगली डिसएग्री को 1 दे देंगे और अग्री को 5 दे देंगे. वो गलत होगा, क्योंकि डिसएग्री इज द ऑपोजिट ऑफ अग्री.
हाँ.
मेरे ख्याल में आप अग्री को ही 5 लेवल ले लो.
ठीक है.
लीस्ट एग्रीमेंट टू स्ट्रॉन्गेस्ट एग्रीमेंट.
ठीक है. लिस्ट एग्रीमेंट टू स्ट्रॉन्गेस्ट एग्रीमेंट. ओके.
हाँ हाँ,
ठीक है सर.
सभी को आगे
ठीक
से
है.
भी.
हाँ सर. ठीक है.
तब दूसरी बात है कि इसको सब स्टेटमेंट के हिसाब से ही है ना, कोई क्वेश्चन नहीं है ना.
नहीं है सर.
हाँ, यहाँ देखो नंबर 5 जरा घुमा देना.
एक मिनट.
द क्वालिटी ऑफ स्पीकर्स या क्वालिटी ऑफ स्पीकर वाज, क्वालिटी ऑफ टुडे स्पीकर वाज, एटसेट्रा ऐसे कुछ कर दो. जैसे कि प्लीज इंडिकेट यहाँ लिखा है.
हाउ डू यू रेट द क्वालिटी ऑफ स्पीकर इनवाइटेड?
हाँ, in my opinion the quality of speaker is etc.
ओके.
और दूसरी बार क्या है, प्लीज इंडिकेट योर सैटिस्फैक्शन लेवल विथ रेस्पेक्ट टू द वेबिनार आई एम एटसेट्रा.
ओके.
ये तो स्कोरिंग नहीं है, तो कुछ भी चलेगा.
ओके.
और यहाँ जो क्वेश्चन नंबर 8 में अगर आप एक 8-10 आइटम्स लीड करके दे सकते हैं, अच्छा होगा.
ओके. ठीक
एक
है.
गेमिफिकेशन ले लो, एक टॉयज ले लो, एक स्टोरी टेलिंग ले लो,
ओके.
सिनारियो
ठीक है.
राइटिंग ले लो.
ठीक है.
ऐसा कुछ एक 8-10 आइटम लगा दो,
ठीक है सर.
जिसके कारण आपको स्पीकर्स भी मिल जाए.
ठीक है. ठीक है सर.
ठीक है.
ये
तब
बात
आपको क्या करना है अभी, वो 7428 का ब्रेकअप देना है.
यस सर. 7428 नहीं सर, 11,000 का. 7428 में वो ब्रेकअप नहीं है. 11,000 में है हमारे पास वो ब्रेकअप.
जिसमें एज मिलता है.
एज नहीं मिलता सर, उसमें स्टूडेंट कैटेगरी मिल रही है. स्टूडेंट है, प्रोफेशनल है.
ठीक है. ठीक है. एज कहीं नहीं मिलेगा क्या?
एज नहीं लिया था सर अभी तक, अभी तो अपन ने अभी तक.
अच्छा, यहाँ एज क्यों नहीं मांगा आपने बैंड मांगा था.
यहाँ पर हमने एक एज बैंड ये दिया, एज ग्रुप दिया है सर. 15 to 25 से 26 to 35.
आप एज मांगो ना.
एज मांगे.
हाँ.
ओके. ठीक है.
तो उसको तो आसान रहता कि स्टैंडर्ड डेविएशन वगैरह मारने के लिए. ये तो अगर 45 या 46 हो जाए तो इट बिकम्स द डिफरेंस ऑफ 10 years.
ओके, एग्जैक्ट एज ही इसमें डाल देता हूँ सर मैं। ठीक
हाँ हाँ
ठीक ठीक है सर, ये मैं करवा लेता हूँ करेक्शंस।
इसका भी अगर हमें पता चलता है कि किसी एक सेशन में टॉपिक इस तरह का हो सकता है, तब मे बी वी कैन एक्सपैंड दिस टू 30-40 क्वेश्चंस। वो उसके सोचना पड़ेगा। जैसे हमने प्लेयर सेटिस्फेक्शन का करा था,
जी
उसी
हाँ
तरह ही हम बना सकते हैं, बट उसको काफी सोचना पड़ेगा।
ठीक है
अभी
सर,
अभी
वो
नहीं।
भी करते हैं।
हाँ
आज हम नाइट में से 9:30 पे बैठेंगे,
ठीक है ठीक है ठीक है,
ठीक है
ओके।
ना? ठीक है,
थैंक यू, बाय
थैंक यू सर।
बाय।